I'm Dr. Chip Benight from the University of Colorado Springs, the National Institute for Human Resilience, and this is another segment of our GRIT video podcast that I'm doing today, and I'm excited to have a very special guest today, Mr. Yemi Mobaladi. And Yemi is a leader in our community in many, many different ways. He's contributed to the city business environment, is an entrepreneur. He's also got a background in religion and has been a pastor. He's a spiritual leader for the community. And I'm very excited today to talk to you, Yemi, specifically about spiritual wellness. So welcome. I'm glad to have you today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You bet. So I think we'd start out with, the pandemic has really pushed people very hard in our community to adjust and to adapt and to make sense of what's happening. And, I was just reading an article today on spirituality and religion and trauma, and they talk about how trauma can impact a person's sense of faith and their religious practices and so forth. And so I thought I'd open up today with a question for you about how you view the concept of spiritual wellness and how you kind of think about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you rather me call you Chip or Dr. Benight?
Chip is great. Thank you.
Okay. I knew you were going to say that. I was raised, as an immigrant, raised in a West African country. We were taught to give honor to who honor is due and call people by their proper title. But I will respect your wishes to call you Chip. Chip, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this program and really help add value to the work that you're doing. So I want to thank you first and foremost. To answer your question, my concept of spiritual wellness, spirituality to me, if you break down the word, it has to do with the first part of the word spirit, and not as in like ghosts, as in that type of spirit, but the essence of our being, our soul, our inner life. There's different parts to who we are and our makeup. We have the physical, but when we talk about spirituality, we're looking at the inner part of our being, and the wellness of that part of who we are is as important as any type of wellness, especially in terms like this. And when we're dealing with spirituality, it's, it many times it's our connection to something that is bigger than ourselves. It connects to this search for meaning, this search for purpose, this search for why. There is your what you do, and there's why you do. And I feel like spirituality provides this bigger purpose to who we are. And so that's how I see spirituality. And the wellness of that piece of who we are is really important, because it creates stability and creates that firm footing that we need to be able to live life well, especially in the midst of crisis.
Yes, and that in particular to me is really an intriguing and important issue, because it's, the pandemic, since it struck in March, it's, I think, turned us pretty upside down in a lot of ways. And when we think about wellness, both sort of physical wellness and mental health wellness, and then spiritual wellness, how do you think that the pandemic has sort of hit people, if you will, from the perspective of spiritual wellness?
Totally. And I want to go back to something that you just said. When we talk about wellness, it just triggered another thought from me with regards to spirituality. Even though spirituality is, I just explained it as this inner being, this bigger purpose. The reality is, it's not devoid of all the other aspects of our wellness. It's connected. In fact, there's a practice that I do every year at the beginning of the year, and it's a spiritual rule. And I create a set of game plans and guidelines for my year.
Hmm.
And these game plans are around 4 different quadrants. And I always look at it from the 4 quadrants of wholeness. And it's a practice I actually learned in my spiritual formation class in seminary. And the 4 quadrants of wholeness is you have your physical, your intellectual, your emotional, and your social. And so when approaching spirituality in the practice that I use, I'm also looking at all four aspects of my being. And if you can picture that as 4 boxes, and in the middle, right in the middle of all of those, is spirituality. And you can see that it touches the physical, the intellectual, the emotional, and the social. And so that's the well-being of our spiritual being is also connected to the well-being of our mental outlook on life.
Hmm.
Getting rest and staying active, or
Right.
having positive and meaningful relationships. And here's a cool thing that I also learned in that class in seminary. So when you look at all the physical, intellectual, emotional, social, they all end with the letter L. And for those that believe in a higher power or God, the the Hebrew term for God that has been adopted by other religions is the Hebrew term El.
Hmm.
So there is that El, but when we are pursuing spirituality, you're looking at all these L's,
Yeah.
and your well-being in all these L's are really interconnected. So I would, to me, that's always been that was a fascinating reality, and has really really shaped the way I approach my days, my weeks, my months, and the year.
Well, and the thing that comes up for me when you say that is the concept of love, and starts with an L, and this sort of
Ah,
interconnectedness of loving ourselves, loving our neighbors, our friends, our community members, and how that all intersects too.
I love it.
I think that's
I'm
interesting.
gonna write that one down. I hadn't thought about that one. Yeah, thank you for sharing that too. And to answer your second question,
Yeah.
how's I think you said, well, spiritual coping has been influenced by the pandemic.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Um, I that's an interesting one because it depends on the person. There are folks that it's just I talked about our well-being, the well-being of our inner lives being that foundation, being that firm footing.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say the pandemic for many of us has shifted that,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also shifted that in such a way that some of the where we for if you grew up in a Christian faith, there are a lot of different religions and faith expressions, and that's the thing about religion is that it's a it's an official form of a set of rituals and practices that pushes you towards spirituality. And the faith tradition that I come from is Christianity. And so what COVID-19 pandemic also did was close churches. And
Mm-hmm.
so for some of us, the the spaces and the rhythms that we had, to get to find that to find that spiritual centeredness, I think that's the word I'm looking for,
Yes.
is gone. I actually I meet with a spiritual director. We 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 meet one on one, and that hadn't happened to about just the last month. We finally said let's try this virtually, but that a lot of my practices, my spiritual practices, has been affected by the pandemic. So for me, it's been harder to find that meaning and that connection. And I would go as far as to say, as for most of this COVID season, up to about 3 weeks ago, I've just felt off.
Mm-hmm.
I felt this, and I know I'm not the only one.
Oh
This
yeah.
constant feeling of feeling off, and not only my spiritual practices, the very focused spiritual practices, gone, but all the things that I was talking about, the emotional and the social and the intellectual, all those habits and rhythms that contribute to our spiritual centeredness, those also have been shifted. So yeah, so for me and for many, it's been hurt in many ways.
Yeah. And so how have you been able to manage that? Because that's really, you're not alone. I think many, many, many people can relate to what you just said. And so you've had to cope with that in some specific ways. So how have you kind of managed that whole centeredness piece, given everything's knocked off kilter a bit?
Yeah, it's seizing the opportunity, and that has come over time. And one of the ways that I find direction in my life is seeking out the wisdom of friends and friendtors and
Mm.
mentors. I've always, I like the phrase friendtors because these
Hmm.
are people who have a, mentor, just, typically they're a leader in your life,
Hmm.
and a friend is a peer-to-peer relationship, but also having people in your lives that, check both boxes. They know how to come alongside of you as a friend, but they also know how to, speak truth and also push you in the right direction.
Yes.
And I've had those mentors have been able to call out things in me and also push me in the right direction. And so they've been able to help me seize this moment and see it as an opportunity, not just as a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
How do we in the business world and leadership world, with your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis, as you do it as part of strategic planning. I
Hmm.
think it's also worth trying that in our personal lives too. And
Hmm.
so, and typically what you do is that you capitalize on the strength, you look at the weaknesses, and you see the weaknesses as opportunities. And that's what I've had to do in this season is an inventory of everything going on,
Hmm.
including being around my family more, which has been a blessing and also been challenging. Uh,
Yes.
can both of those exist in the same? Absolutely. And in some ways, I'm grateful that I'm around my kids more than I've ever been.
Right.
They've been born, and in other ways, it's been challenging. And our family rhythms have had to shift and look
Right.
different. And so it's an opportunity. It's a challenge, but also an opportunity. And so I confess I was just kind of doing life for
Hmm.
about the first month or 2 months, and many people will probably say, yeah, they're probably in a similar boat. Well, just kind of going with emotions, waiting for life to get back to normal.
Right. Right.
That's kind of what I was in. Like, yeah, when are things going to reopen? When is everything going to get back to normal? And
Hmm.
when the reality sank inside of me that this could potentially be the new normal for a while.
Hmm.
Okay, what does this new normal what opportunities does this new normal provide for me? But I would say that I was not able to get there by myself, and I've had the blessing of having, again, great friends, mentors, and mentors in my life, and great conversations with my wife as well as we're
Yeah.
processing this current season moving forward.
Well, I think you highlight one of the critical things that we've talked about in our program, the GRIP program, is the importance of social connection
Mm,
and having those relationships so that, when we were forced to stay at home and not have those in-person connections, I think that really made that a challenge. And so I really appreciate your kind of centeredness around the relational piece and how your friends and friendtors and mentors help you with that. That's great. I think the question of centeredness and the way you are able, you have this capacity, I think, to turn challenges into opportunities that really you write about that. And I think it's a hallmark of how you kind of approach things. When you think about envisioning the future from today, how does that sort of entrepreneurial spirit, that capacity to turn problems into opportunities, how do you think that relates to spirituality?
that's a great question, Chip, and it's when you actually were kind enough to give me some of these questions in advance for me to think through. And when I got to that question and I saw the word entrepreneurial spirit, it's something it's in my bio. It's part of
Hmm.
my white statement.
Hmm.
But I just seeing you, just getting your email and hearing it from you.
Hmm.
I don't know. I did almost like a double take, like a pause. I'm going,
Mm.
huh, spirit.
Yeah.
I've never really given that some thought to what that means to to have an entrepreneurial spirit. I said earlier that spirit is kind of this inner being, our
Mhm.
soul and alive, and to have an entrepreneurial spirit. I see a lot of my vocational interest and also, just scholarly interest is the integration of sacred and secular. This is why my being in this city, people have called me a unicorn because I'm in the business world, I'm in government, but yet, I came into the city as a pastor. I started a
Right.
church, and I still have the opportunity to teach and preach at my church. I don't see a separation of both worlds. A lot of times the viewpoint is that there's a separate, there's a sacred and secular. We worship on
Mhm.
Sunday, that's our spiritual day, and
Mhm.
other days are confined to non-spiritual thing. And the word entrepreneurial spirit really embodies both.
Mhm.
And I said earlier, I finally met with my spiritual director about a month ago. We met virtually. We thought, okay, perhaps we don't know when next we're going to meet in person. Spiritual direction, from my experience, has been best being done in person with my spiritual director. So we finally met virtually. And in that meeting, it was actually quite powerful and profound. As I spent time in silence and as we began to process my reflections from the silence, one of the things we began to process was this term, and perhaps a buzzword we're hearing a lot today, called pivoting.
Mm.
And
Yes.
we're talking about businesses pivoting.
Mhm.
Some of them are mild, some of them are dramatic, but since the pandemic, the businesses that are going to survive these times are the ones that are able to pivot and to recover um, this period. And that's a very popular word, pre-COVID. I mean, it's a very popular word in the startup world, in the entrepreneurial world. When your first model isn't working, the CEO and the team, they pivot to plan B.
Mhm.
And it's not necessarily, it's not always mean desperation. It's a tool for growth. It's
Mhm.
a tool, it's an opportunity, because you have this dream. That dream did not work out, then you reimagine your assets and your talents and think about how you can use that differently. And certainly as a business person myself, we've been lucky, and my business partner has done a fantastic job in being able to pivot one of our businesses from a cafe into a neighborhood market.
Yeah.
So
Right.
here I am where I'm doing pivoting with my business as a small business development administrator for the city. I'm helping and talking to lots of businesses about pivoting. So it's all external, external, external.
Right.
And some would say that's the secular.
Yes.
I mean, I'm in the middle of my spiritual direction session, and I had this big, almost ouch moment, like a 2x4 was just smacked in my head, and I felt like, in that moment, God was saying, "Well, how's your soul pivoting?
Mhm.
Um, how's your soul not just trying to survive through these times, but thrive through these times? What is the opportunity that you see in the midst of this internally?"
Mm.
So here I was, just kind of waiting for life to get back to normal. That's
Right.
not the message I was telling businesses.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
you can't wait for life to be normal. You have to seize the moment and see perhaps how pivoting could be helpful, because one of my businesses pivoted, and now we're not only just surviving, we're thriving. We have a new model. We we're gonna we're coming out of this more creative, more innovative. And
That's
so
great.
I hadn't really thought about that from a soul perspective. What does it look like to come out of this more creative, more innovative? What is the opportunity here to grow?
Mhm.
And that was a big moment for me.
Yes.
And so for me, what that looks like is I'm reading more.
Mm.
Um, that's giving my soul such great life. What that also looks like for me is I'm writing. It's always been a dream I've had to, write and perhaps even be published.
Mhm.
But I always thought, okay, that's 10 years down the line when I have more
Mm.
time.
Right.
So guess what? I said, with my wife, in the evenings, part of our connecting and just, it's just watching this TV show Friends. And so sometimes in the evening, my wife is watching the TV show Friends, and I have my computer and I'm writing. And gardening is another way I've been pivoting. And
Mhm.
so I had to do that internal soul searching to not just stall and wait for life to get back to normal, but to seize the moment and figure out perhaps what might God be inviting me in this season. And I got to tell you, that's the reason why my last 3 weeks have felt differently, not from an external perspective, from a soul perspective.
Right.
I feel more. I feel a little bit of joy coming back. I feel more at peace, and part of that has been my soul pivoting.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think the the ability that you have that I think is really useful for other people to hear and think about is to do some self-exploration in the middle of chaos, really. And you were pivoting externally, but then the question is, wait a minute, let me do a check-in here to see what do I need emotionally, spiritually, in this case spiritually, and be able to then kind of put together some specific value-based priorities for yourself, which I think is pretty central to this. When you talked about spiritual centeredness, I had this image in my mind of a tire as we're driving along, and if we have a tire that gets way out of balance, and when you're trying to drive, the car's like, rocking back and forth because there's a tire that's way out of balance. And what you're describing is that feeling on the initial part of being out of balance a little bit, and then recentering it. And that recentering process, I think, is pretty vital for people during disasters and during pandemics, because
Especially,
everything is turned upside down. I mean, my family, we went through Hurricane Andrew. My wife was 5 months pregnant at the time, and it turned our lives upside down. I mean, it was crazy for the rest of the time I was in Miami. So I really can relate to that sense of, I got to get this back on track here. And that doesn't mean just going to work and doing things that are normal. It's beyond that.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's really good.
So
I like your imagery of the tire. I might steal that one too.
So
imageries.
The last question, because I really appreciate having your time today, and we've kind of covered it in some ways, but I think your sort of talent and abilities to move fluidly, I think, from kind of, like you said, the secular world back into the spiritual and the religious world, and this community in particular has a very strong, I think, religious community in all kinds of faiths. So it's not just Christian faiths, obviously Jewish and others, Islam and so forth. I think the question, I think, is what kind of advice might you give to others who might be sort of questioning faith or frustrated by the pandemic or other issues in the world? How would you give them some advice to manage that as they're kind of coping with all this?
Yeah, that's good. And I really appreciate this last question. And I take it very seriously to be in a position to help influence others or shape their hearts. And so this question I take very seriously. And I gave it a lot of thought, and also I looked at it inwardly, like, Yemi, when people would say, Yemi, what would you tell your younger self or yourself 5 years ago? And so I have three things. So the first one is to the person who's questioning their faith or spiritual direct connection right now in the midst of this pandemic. First thing I would say is, you're okay. You are okay. You're more than okay. We all are. Join the club. Welcome. Even the best, the strongest leaders in our community and in our country and world are all struggling. Circumstantial doubt is normal and it's common. It's okay to question. A friend once told me a while back, in my mid to late 20s, I was in a season where I was questioning my childhood faith and didn't know if I even wanted to pursue it anymore, believe it. And sometimes in my faith tradition, you're told you can't question. And I always remember what this friend said. He goes, well, if you believe in God, it's okay to question because he's big and he can take it.
Mm.
He actually welcomes your questions.
Mm-hmm.
He's not scared.
That's
So
good.
I'd say go for it, because part of the healing process is questioning.
Okay.
And
Good.
then number two is, I love this phrase. Perhaps some may not like it, but it says, embrace the suck. Embrace the suck. It's maybe a kinder way of saying it is embrace the opportunity.
Yeah.
And it's a military saying, embrace the suck. It's also a very Buddhist concept.
Yes.
You know, it's because when you deny the reality that you're in and what is really happening, it actually creates more suffering. And that's a Buddhist, that's a whole Buddhist concept. And, you know, there's power in embracing what's happening in our lives, even when it seems things are not centered, because that's the way we get through them. So if we're in denial, that's just going to take longer and harder. When COVID first, the whole COVID pandemic first started, about 2 weeks into it, a friend of mine reached out to me just to see how I was doing. And then I did the same to check in with him. And his response was a picture in his living room of a buffalo. And I didn't know how to respond to that. I was like,
right.
Yeah, what is that about? And so I said, thanks for the picture. That's a really cool picture, but what is that about? And then he began to explain to me the difference between buffaloes and cows in Colorado. You see, when the storms come from the mountain, and they roll from the west towards the east, they say what cows do is very natural. We see the storms coming from the west, so what they do is they start to run to the east.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is, you know,
It's
cows are not as fast. Yeah. And so they're caught in the middle of the storm.
Uh-huh.
But what buffaloes do, actually is interesting and very unique, is that they actually, instead of running away, they actually run directly into the storm.
Wow.
And by running directly into the storm, straight into the storm, they actually are minimizing the amount of pain, time, and frustration that they experience from the storm.
That's great.
That metaphor is just so true for all of us, because life is full of storm. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, here's a storm that has affected the whole world. Mm-hmm. And which is unique because before this, we were all experiencing our own individual personal storm, family storm, work storm. But here we are, we're all experiencing the same storm. So it goes to my first point, you're okay, because everybody is off. Yeah. The second part is embrace the suck, because don't run away from it, run into it like the buffaloes, because when you run straight through it, you are actually minimizing the amount of pain and frustration. And that begins to bring some clarity to you. And the third part, as we've covered earlier, is pivot, pivot, pivot. Mm-hmm. Even the smallest pivot can make a difference in your life. In my Christian tradition, there's a Bible verse that the Apostle Paul, who was a guy who was going to a lot of the different Greek countries to talk about his experience and his transformation, and he's talking to the church in Corinth, and I just love what he says to them, because this is kind of getting back to your earlier question of what spirituality is, and this is kind of how I want to just kind of wrap up this whole thing. And so I feel like his message to people in the land of Corinth that were also suffering, they were experiencing storms, is so perfect. And this is what he says to them in 2 Corinthians 4:16. He says, this is why we never give up. Mm. He says, our bodies are dying, but our spirits are being renewed every day. Mm. For our present troubles are small, and they won't last very long. I actually hate that part, because they were actually going through a lot of troubles, but he calls them small. He says, they're small, but they won't last very long. Yet they produce a glory that vastly outweighs all the problems and will last forever. And this is how he concludes. He says, so we don't look at the troubles we see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on the things that cannot be seen. but the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever. So how I hear this is, COVID, pandemic, the suffering will be gone. In fact, we're going to move on to new suffering. Unfortunately, that's just part of the makeup of being humans and living in this world. But those things will come and go, they'll be gone. But the things that we cannot see will last forever. And that's the pivoting, for me, I'm writing.
Yes.
It's the things that are born in this season if we will run through the storm and embrace the suck. Those are the things, the glory that he's talking about, that will vastly outweigh all the problems. Those are the things that will last long.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I think it emphasizes those 3 points are really important for people to think about, because, when you put that in the context of breaking down barriers that I think you're good at in terms of the different groups and areas that you work in, I think you've done a fantastic job of breaking down barriers. And I think in this context of the pandemic, one of the things that we have to be careful about is how there's artificial barriers that get brought up, and we begin to see division and challenges with that. And I think when we think about pivoting and we think about running into the storm, and we think about that sort of self-awareness of our own spirituality, your points are really well taken if we can move them out to do it collectively.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, that's good.
I really appreciate everything you do, and I appreciate your time this morning. And maybe we can, obviously we'll visit together in person at some point here, and I look forward to having a longer term friendship and relationship with you.
Same here. And before you stop recording, I just want to publicly honor you and let the listeners and the viewers know that, we're lucky to have you in this community, especially in times like this. That before the call, I was telling you, Chip, that every other call your name is mentioned, and it comes with such great appreciation and respect and value for the work that you are doing as you are fighting for the mind and the hearts and the souls of so many in our community and beyond our community. So I'm really, really grateful to know you, and I'm excited to just continue to, track your journey and see, what difference it's going to make in all of our lives. So thank you for doing this.
My pleasure. So have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Okay.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye, Yemi.
Bye-bye.